I am talking more about the theory than the policy, as it happens in this presentation. We'll talk about that probably in discussion as well. But I'm going to start off with a plug. Okay? And that is that as well as writing on trade, which I've done a couple of, one article in a journal called the Journal of American Affairs, which curiously was developed to support Trump's agenda, and then within 3 months it said Trump's a disaster. And it's a very intelligent, like the old-fashioned journals of ideas you used to see in the 19th century. That's the calibre of the editing and the type of articles being asked for. So I was actually quite pleased to ask for them write for them on trade, and a lot of what I'll talk about here is covered in more detail in that paper. But as well as doing that, a couple of conferences I spoke at, I've read all this neoclassical stuff all the time. And, you know, I've got two choices: throw it out the window, which doesn't work and you're in a 747 and flying across the Atlantic, or make a parody of it. And I wrote two parodies, one of the theory of comparative advantage, which I'll talk about here, one of the attempt to explain the crisis, the post-crisis, in what's termed secular stagnation, which Larry Summers dragged out an idea that was 80 years old and wrong when it was first invented and brought it back to me to explain now. And the third was a bunch of economists in France who wrote a rather, you know what the word denialism implies in French? It implies you're a Holocaust denier. And they used that term, economic denialists, to talk about people who are critical of economic theory. They were saying it's all very unscientific and experimental. So I had to go at the three of them. And I really didn't think it was going to... What happened was I had a brilliant cartoonist who offered to illustrate it for me. And I thought this would sell bugger all copies because it's such a niche market to be laughing at the mainstream economists. You've got to know a bit about comparative advantage, know why the jokes are funny. And ditto macroeconomics for why I'm setting up Krugman and Summers, and those so-called simplifying assumptions, which I prefer to call fantasies, that they have to make their mathematics, easier for them. And lo and behold, it hit number 866 on Amazon for a while. That might be because it costs £2.99, but anyway, it's a bit of a laugh. It actually made number one in economic theory, which I was very pleased about. So if you want to have a bit of fun, download a copy of that. It's Kindle at the moment, coming out in hard copy in a couple of weeks' time, I hope. And it said you're $2.99 here and $4.22 in the States. So it's a cheap way to annoy mainstream economists, and you might get a few laughs out of it. Now, I was actually, because of some of the discussions I've had about Ricardo, I'm now being targeted by some of the mainstreamers in Twitter, which tends to happen. And one guy was trying to say that Ricardo didn't have a theory of comparative advantage, which I could sort of concede to some extent, but he also argued that I said Ricardo was saying you could move capital easily from one point to another inside a country, and he said, well, that phrase doesn't say it. I felt like saying, it's English. This is what these words mean. But anyway, so one guy intervened and said, can you give me, a trained economist, and explain where Ricardo was mistaken in the theory and its consequences? So I wrote a tweet reply, which I think you could actually go home after reading that tweet. That's pretty much the whole thing. Machinery is not mobile between industries, period. So reducing trade barriers destroys capacity in the less competitive industries in both countries. And whether you get total output rising or not depends upon investment and economies of scale. That's it. Okay? That's a realistic start for what trade theory should be about. But what they do, of course, is a totally unrealistic world of believing that capital is mobile. So here's where it all began, with Ricardo's example. Who's actually, just out of curiosity, in a room this big, how many have actually read Ricardo's principles? That's not a bad, it's about maybe between 5 and 10% of the audience. That's pretty good. So here's the example. Maybe so circumstanced that produced cloth may require the labour of 100 men for 1 year. And if, I like this, most people don't realise, if she attempted to make the wine, at least he conceded that was a fantastical assumption. If she attempted to make the wine, it might require the labour of 120 men for the same time. And he then preludes and said, you find it worthwhile to import wine and purchase it by the exportation of cloth. So we've got an absolute advantage, or an internal advantage, in producing cloth over wine. Then he says to produce the wine in Portugal might take only 80 men and produce the cloth 90. So it's better at both, but less better at making cloth, which of course was completely empirically wrong at the time. the invention of the spinning jenny in England, and the industrialisation of England was built around cloth. So it's quite a fallacious example at that point, but that never stops an economist, so on we go. He said, it's advantageous to export the wine in exchange for the cloth. And he said it might take place even though Portugal's better at both than England is. And that's the beauty of the concept, because in effect he's conceding the case that was made by the opponents of free trade. Oh, Portugal's better at us. What if Portugal's better than us at everything? Well, the rest of the world's better at us than everything. They'll wipe out UK industry. He's saying even if they are better at everything, we'll still benefit. Okay? And that's a very seductive idea. Now, the trouble is, yes, the numbers add up. If you do the calculations, and I've got that down the back for anybody who wants to take a look at it in graphical form after I finish the presentation. I don't want to glory their stuff by explaining it here. So the numbers add up, but the question is, can you move resources between one industry and another? Now, here's Ricardo's confidence statement. The difference between a single country and many is easily accounted for by considering the difficulty with which capital moves from one country to another to seek a more profitable employment, and the activity with which it invariably passes from one province, he says province on industry, maybe he's realising it's pretty stupid, so slip another word inside there, one province to another in the same country. Okay. Now that's true of capital as money. And that's what I think what economists have done is effectively treat machinery as being the same as money. But it's utterly false of physical machinery. And it's ridiculous how they'll, mainstreamers will just fob you off when you talk about the definition of capital and how important it is to get it right. And they happily say capital is, add up the machine's monetary value and it's all you need to know. It's no way was it easy for England to turn a wine press into a spinning jenny, okay? Which is what's implied. And Portugal wouldn't have found it particularly easy to go in the opposite direction. But that's what's physically being implied. Now, because you focus on the labour, and this is what the point of the satire I wrote as the introduction to those cartoons about Ricardo, and I won't give you the punchline for the satire yet. Maybe I get a couple of wines in me, I will. But the point was that people were so focused on getting, oh yes, his numbers are right, but the numbers implied you could produce anything with just labour alone. No, you can't, period. Okay? You can produce grapes, if you find grapes growing wild in the bush somewhere and pull them out of the tree. Okay, there was a time when we just had our own hands, but the defining feature of us is tool-making species. And we've been doing that for 150, 300, well, God knows, 700,000, it's going back millions of years now. They're ignoring the fact that we use machinery in some sense or other to produce everything. And particularly in advanced nations these days, the machinery is absolutely essential. The labour is relatively unimportant. So what actually happens when you open up trade? Well, if it's a severe change, I'm thinking of things like what happened back in Australia in 1973, when I was actually in third year at university at the time, and Gough Whitlam was the leader of the Labor Party and the Prime Minister, and he took the advice of the Productivity Commission, as it's now called, Industries Assistance Commission as it was known back then, Industries Assassination Commission as it was known by the trade unions, for a 25% overnight without warning cut in tariffs. Now, that sort of thing tends to turn that type of industry into this type of structure, the Rust Belt stuff. The capital doesn't move. Or if it does move, it's shipped overseas. Now, so both these things are realities of actual capital. When there have been major changes to trade arrangements, industries which were once profitable are no longer. They might have been derelict industries, they might have been ones you want to get rid of, but the capital did not move. That's the essential point. Or if it did move, it moved between countries, which is the opposite of what Ricardo was assuming. So machinery doesn't move from one industry to another. You can't turn that steel mill into a sewing machine. You can produce sewing machines using it, but you can't make it into that. You can't convert the machine. And machines move more easily between countries than between industries because they can. You can't move a machine from one industry to another. You can move a machine from one country to another. So it's the opposite of what Ricardo is assuming, which is the typical state, what they call simplifying assumptions. So you've got either costless movement of machinery between industries, or you assume that a trade change is going to have no impact upon macroeconomic activity. Now, my first exposure to this came when I organised this conference back in 1979, 1980 in Australia. Fabulous cartoon, by the way, by Australia's leading political cartoonist at the time, Patrick Cook. he gave me the usual sort of tariff barrier type. This is a couple of the then Prime Minister, who was Malcolm Fraser, staring down behind tariff walls at these foreigners saying, we won't let you in. And I said, look, mate, that's just not what I want to convey. I want to convey the confusion. And I worked out, I rang him up to give him an idea of how I could redo the image he'd actually drawn to make it, the words suit my approach more. And instead he said, I thought I heard an Asian and Australian business each trying to sell each other a stuffed kangaroo. Perfect cover. So this is Alan Powell came along to that, and he was the chief economist at the Industries Assassination Commission, and he gave a talk about how you can cut a 1/4 cut in the tariff of Australia's most protected industries. This had already happened by this stage. It's happened once. So he was talking about doing it again. And he said that would have you'd have a 5.5% fall in car manufacturing. By the way, Australia no longer manufactures cars. You're probably aware of that. But there'd be a 2.3% rise in coal mining. Of course, you know, we produce a lot of coal even now. And then he has this, the main assumptions underlying the computations are good macroeconomic management prevails throughout. Now you can guess who asked him the question, what does that mean? This was his answer. Aggregate employment is unaffected by the tariff change. I'll go back again. Okay. He assumed that aggregate unemployment would not change, you just redistribute workers between industries. That was a crucial assumption of the computable general equilibrium model they used to reach those predictions. So if you assume there's going to be no macroeconomic impact, you've assumed away the question everybody's asking you. Now, they ignore issues in modelling as well even today. So Krugman, you know, got a Nobel Prize. He talks about macroeconomics these days, but his Nobel Prize was in effectively patterns of trade, with the other bringing in economies of scale and so on. So this is the paper that really earned him the Nobel Prize. Now, what's his production function? It will be assumed there's only one factor, labour. That's a great advance over Ricardo, isn't it? Not. Okay. All goods produced with the same cost function. Okay. They call these simplifying assumptions. They're absurdities. Okay. And then it's not any better any now. In terms of writing this article, I had to check and see, has anybody done what I think is essential, which is properly model the role of machinery in production to then talk about the impact of trade on production. This is an article from 2016, so I think I can get away with calling that recent. He says, while investment drives several aspects of aggregate economy, and this is somebody whose first, well, obviously not that his first language is not English, the editor's first language isn't English either. You'll see two major English errors there. Aggregate economy, trade models frequently abstract investment decisions. Okay? So we're leaving out investment regarding capital goods by considering an endowment economy. So you don't even have production. You've got goods falling out manna from heaven style. Okay? He says, in models that do assume investment decisions, capital goods are commonly assumed to be homogeneous. And what does that mean? You assume the same machine can produce either cars or knaps, whatever you feel like. Okay? Now that is magic. Okay? This is what you assume the typical machine looks like. Okay? What it should be. We should be looking at the impact of trade policy on investment, innovation and economies of scale, because one way in which it can work, if you open up a larger market and you have a technology which benefits from a dramatic drop, very high fixed costs, and therefore distributing those fixed costs over a larger scale means the units become cheaper, then that's a major reason why opening up a larger market may mean you have a drop in overall costs and an increase in output. That's a valid reason to say trade may work. It may also lead to innovation, but of course the other opposite can happen. It can destroy local innovation. And I've seen that happen with Australian technology quite a few times. And there's empirical research. When you look at I don't work in this area, so I've got to quote other people here. And the main person who's done the work is a guy called Danny Roddick. And he's done some very good work. He tends to be a bit, he's got a lot of feet in the neoclassical camp, but he's well and truly capable of standing outside as well, more so than I'd say Joe Stiglitz is, and certainly more so than Krugman. And what he's found is, he says, that trading in illusions. Advocates of global economic integration hold out utopian visions of prosperity that develop, and just talking developing countries now, so it's very relevant to the UK. I'm sorry, I'm 90% serious. If they open their borders to commerce and capital, this hollow promise diverts poor nations' attention and resources from key domestic innovations needed to spur economic growth. That's realism. Okay? So there is some realism in the research that's happening out there at the moment. And at the same time, trade policy, I would make the major focus of trade policy ensuring balanced current accounts, no current account deficits, aim for zero. Because clearly that was supposed to be solved by the price system. Liberalising exchange rates was supposed to eliminate current account deficits. Well, hasn't it done a fabulous job? Your trade deficit's about, what, 4% of GDP? Germany's trade surplus is about 10. And Japan's had a surplus of between 5 and 10% for about 40 years. So there's no way in which there's been the price mechanism and exchange rates have solved this for whatever reason you might want to give. And some of the best research has been done by a place called the Atlas of Economic Complexity, which is a Harvard University computing initiative with a couple of economists involved in it, but mainly done by the computing people, particularly Cesar Hidalgo. And what they do is they take, unfortunately, only data on exports and imports, because the SITC database gives you a very good record of what's produced, what's imported and exported by each country. And that implies to some extent what's produced by those countries as well. And this is the pattern shown for the UK. What did it export in 2016? So again, we wouldn't expect that gas turbines alone were 4.5% of UK exports. But these are all grouped by industry types. Gold is an expert for the UK. I wonder where they are. But it's a very interesting computing approach to saying what are industries, how close are they to each other in terms of capacity to link one industry to another. And they say a lot of the development that occurs in new industries is by combining old ones. And my favourite example there is, it doesn't particularly strike many chords here, I imagine, it worked very much better in Australia, is windsurfing. Okay? To have a windsurfing industry develop, or somebody to think about the idea, it helps to have a sail manufacturer and a surfboard manufacturer in the same location. So that type of, those two industries are close together, and you can combine them to produce a new industry, and that's a large part of what they're talking about as an industrial development process for that, that approach of going. Now, you may know that I voted for Brexit. It wasn't because I thought Brexit was going to be great for the UK. I thought, I said, well, my position was that of Groucho Marx. I'm in a club. Do I want to be here? The club being the EU. The answer was no. I see that as being a major divisive force in Europe, not the unifying force it's believed to be by most people. I see that's actually leading to most of the social conflict in Europe these days, particularly the policies of ordoliberalism. But when you look at the papers, all the predictions made about how catastrophic Brexit would immediately be, you know, the usual story, I get called Dr. Doom, okay? I'm the one who goes, we'll all be ruined. This time I say, chill out, it's not going to have much of an impact at all. Richard Werner was the same as me on that front, did much more empirical work than I did, saying it's going to be a trivial impact. The main thing that hits the level of economic activity is the level of credit. That's rising right now. We both agree on that particular interpretation as well as the data. Brexit won't have much impact. You know, we'll all be ruined was coming out of the IMF and the bank, Carney at the Bank of England and so on. What the basis of all that was the fact that they thought specialisation was what drives increasing production over time. No, it's not. Investment in manufacturing is what drives success over time. And that's what Britain hasn't been doing while it's been part of the EU and before. The scale here is a bit misleading, but guess which one is the UK for percentage of manufacturing exports over time? Which line? Yeah, okay. Which is Germany? And the world's sitting in the middle, obviously. Now, if you look down, the UK, of course, is the bottom line. And it starts here from 1990, then it jumps to 2008. So it's a fairly misleading chart. That's the design decline over 20-something years before this comes along. So you used to be between, look, about 17% of GDP. You plunged until the financial crisis to 10%, and that looks like the minimum you're ever going to sustain. You've got to the bottom. Now, Germany, on the other hand, is up at 23%, fell a bit with the financial crisis and revived once more, and is now running at about 23% of GDP. Simple empiricism, which economy works better? Okay. So, and John Mills has argued for a long time that one of the reasons that the manufacturing sector has declined so much is the overvaluation of the pound, which partly reflects the continuing belief that England has an empire. No, you don't. The UK, pardon me. But that's the imperial attitude to the pound. The pound should be high. That is a bad deal, as Donald Trump would say. A high value of your pound destroys your manufacturing base. It's happening to America, it's happened here as well. And so the fall that's happened in the value of the pound after the Brexit is potentially recouping a bit of that, at least not as far as was necessary, but at least it's going in the right direction. And credit is far more important for determining the direction of the economy, and as I mentioned, that was rising at the time of the Brexit vote, continued to rise. It's now levelling out. Okay, but that was what was the main reason the economy appeared to get through that period. Had nothing to do with trade specialisation. Now, what I'm trying to get rid of in economics, and I'll end shortly, is what Schumpeter brilliantly called the Ricardian Vice. And this is Schumpeter from the History of Economic Analysis. Very, very chatty way of writing here. He's saying the comprehensive vision of this is not particularly a chatty sentence, but the rest of it is, the vision of a universal interdependence of all the elements of the system that haunted Thunen so much probably could never cost Ricardo a moment as much as an hour's sleep. He ignored all the interconnectedness, which I can understand somebody doing that in 1820, okay? Not in 2020. His interest was in the result of clear-cut, direct practical significance. In order to do that, he piled one simplifying assumption upon another until, having set it up by the assumptions, there are only a few variables left. You get simple one-way relations. In the end, the desired results emerged almost as a tautology. Now, that's the nature of economics even today. And he said, I'll call this the Ricardian Vice. Now, there's no way in which the modern theory uses anything like Ricardo's theory of value or class analysis and so on. But the Ricardian Vice of these so-called simplifying assumptions are in fact fantasies is still well and truly alive. And I'll end with one of my favourites. Of course, we know we had a financial crisis back in 2008 and no one saw it coming. That means I'm a no one, and so is Wynne Godley. And many banks failed. We all know that happened, okay? Now, this paper was just sent to me just recently. I'm getting to another paper in a moment. The Bank of England, of course, has come out and beautifully said that banks create money, okay? Loans create deposits, which is the same thing that the Bundesbank has said the same thing, and the Bank of Norway said the same thing. Now, once it starts to be said by central banks, it's very hard for economists to pretend it doesn't happen. And I was waiting for something like this to come along, but it's even worse than I thought it would be. They wanted to say it makes no difference. That was Paul Krugman's initial reaction, but he didn't bother putting a mathematical model behind saying it made no difference. These guys did. And they said it makes no difference if you assume no risk and therefore no bank defaults. And here's the paper. Loanable funds versus money creation. They say we establish a benchmark result. They get the same allocation when there is no uncertainty and therefore no bank default. In such cases, using the simpler, much simpler, loanable funds approach as a shortcut does not imply any loss of generality. Well, that helps. You live on a planet where there's never been a bank default, use this model. If you don't, go there. So, Ricardo, at least, why he did it, one thing they don't realise as well, because they take this little model out and it's become the basis of economic thinking. When you see the idea of specialisation as really the defining backbone of neoclassical thought, is specialisation leads to everything. Look at Ricardo himself. What was he trying to do? Now, I've got to guess what Ricardo was first famous for. Anybody know?
The law of wind.
Pardon? Huh?
The law of ground?
No. No. The Battle of Waterloo. You don't know. Okay, a friend of mine told me this tale and he said it was a Rothschild. I think he had a Rothschild, somebody like that. And when I wrote my satire, I wanted to have Ricardo being a con man. And I couldn't believe my luck. He was. He's a con man who made £1 million of that day at the Battle of Waterloo, 1812. What happened was he had a spotter watching the conflict, a rider, saw the result. Rider brings over the story as fast as possible to the London Stock Exchange. I don't know if it was Ricardo himself, but I believe it would have been. Goes onto this floor of the exchange and goes, "Sell!" Everybody thinks, my God, we must have lost the Battle of Waterloo. Panic. Everything crashes in price. Ricardo then says, buy. He made £1 million at that time. Imagine what that's worth now. Okay, so he's a con man. Now what he's trying to do here is a con man's job. He wants to win the case, now that he's becoming respectable, because he bought himself a seat in Parliament as well, by the way, for £4,000, small change after he made £1 million profit. You could buy a seat back in those days. You probably still can now. He said, it's been my endeavour in this work to show that the rate of profits can never be increased but by a fall in wages. Now, it's not anti-worker in this case. He wants to bring down wages to transfer money from the landlords to the capitalists, because the capitalists will continue investing rather than wasting their spending on frippery, and therefore you will get you will delay the steady state and have a higher standard of living as a steady state approaches, which is the sort of idea the classicals often had, that there was a steady state somewhere in the future. And then he says, so what he did with that example is just take what his opponents were arguing and say, even if you're right, I can show that we'll still benefit. So it was a debating ploy, and it was a con man's trick, and economics fell for it, and we've paid the price again for the last 200 years. Now, it's not anti-worker but anti-landlord. I mean, he does say the workers will end up getting corn no matter what. Okay, the price falls, they'll pay a lower price for the same amount of corn. He even said they would get a lower standard of living when there was a rise in prices. He thought falling prices were better for workers. But his actual idea was something like this. You start with, you double the level of output, and before the labourer had 25%, and the landlord's 25 and the capitalist 50, and after it you have 22% for the labourer and the landlord and 56% for the capitalist. That was his objective. He was trying to change the distribution of income to benefit capitalists. And he may well have succeeded in that sense by the Corn Laws. So that's the main reason he did it. So economists don't even know, because none of them have read anything older than Sargent, let alone Ricardo. They don't even know. So for further reading yourselves, for a serious take, this is Danny Roddick's work here, and also I'd highly recommend, I brought it up on my link here, The Atlas of Economic Complexity. Well worth taking. There's a book version as well, so if you want to follow up, that's really the way to go. But if you want a slightly serious take, then that's the article I wrote in the Journal of American Affairs, which is online. And for a comic take, you could read the first chapter of my book, which is the preface. And make economists apologise for what they've done for us for the last 200 years. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Steve. You get pretty much to time, which is very impressive. So now I'd like to invite Dorothy to come and give a perspective from more a sort of policy, practical perspective of her experience working on international development policy. Thanks very much, Dorothy.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'm happy to be here, so to be able to.
Do you want to switch the presentation, then it's not sort of starting?
Yeah,
so
it's aggressive with me, isn't it? I'll shut that down here.
It's okay.